Hello, and welcome to Daring Do and the Marked Thief of Marapore by A.K. Yearling with G.M. Berrow. Prologue. The colossal silver unicorn glanced back at his mud-smeared flank and cringed. The dirt didn't cover his hideous scar entirely, but hopefully the blanket of the midnight darkness would dim the monstrosity. Growl! He growled in anger, pacing the steep edge of the vast fiery pit. Let them see my scar! The pony hung his head in shame as a familiar mix of regret and longing overtook him. It seemed like eons since the incident, yet there he was, back in the villages he had once sworn to protect. Except this time, he would destroy them. It was true that without his cutie mark, the stallion had become a mere shadow of his former self. For where there was once joy, there was now endless melancholy. Resentment had replaced kindness, and deep in his heart, cowardice took up residence instead of valor. But the worst part of all was that the inimitable magic he had once had and made him so special in the first place had now been damaged beyond repair. Or so he had thought before learning about the Vehoovious hex. All it required were a few sacrifices, some ancient relics, a captive audience, and a little golden pony. Relatively nothing when one considered the reward. If the hex succeeded, the stallion would gain everything back and more. He might even become the most powerful unicorn in Equestria. He smiled deviously, thinking of all the ways he might use his newfound powers. Things were finally looking up now that he had a plan. He stole one last look at himself in the reflection of a large glass vial. Between his unruly green and black mane, bloodshot eyes, and the scar on his flank, he was unrecognizable. What would the villagers think of their celebrated hero now? That statue in the center of town should be destroyed! The stalwart stallion of Naples. The pony sneered as he strode back and forth, watching the molten lava bubble up and fold over into a sizzling creases. Such a venerated champion. It makes me sick! He tore off a piece of a rusty steel bridle lying nearby and tossed it into the fiery goop. Satisfaction surged through his veins as the metal turned into a glowing red and melted into unrecognizable blobs. It sank under the liquid and disappeared, never to be seen again. All that was left was the rising steam. It was time. The stallion took one last look at his lair and took off in the canter up a narrow dirt tunnel, his mane and tail billowing behind him. Tonight, he would strike again to get closer to his prize, and there was no pony in all of Equestria who could stop him. None but one. Chapter 1. On the High Seas. As Daring Do rifled through her saddlebag, she began to feel queasy. And it wasn't from the rocking of the great ship upon the choppy, churning seas. It was from the realization that all that was left of her rations, which had once been a carefully selected bounty of dried apples, salted carrots, and a seed-crushed loaf, was one stale piece of bread. It wasn't even enough to feed a filly. As a result, the adventurer hadn't been able to sneak off board at any port, let alone into a general store to replenish her provisions. The entire crew was starting to run low on necessary supplies. Of course, borrowing from the ship's gallery again was always an option, but that endeavor would be very risky. The sailors took careful inventory of their commodities, and if something went missing, Daring Do would soon be discovered. 3 days prior, she'd given in to temptation and pilfered a pot pie from a tall stack about to be served to the crew for supper. Luckily, no pony had noticed, Daring hadn't bitten into the flaky, buttery crust and gooey center with satisfaction. But later that evening, when she was full-bellied and poring over her tattered map of deep unknown, a rare guide to the submerged temples of Vehoovious, Daring Do overheard the cook, Greasy Spoon, chiding his helper, Square Meal, for eating more than his fair share. Greasy had threatened Square that if he didn't fess up, he'd go without meals for the entirety of the next week. Square Meal lied out of sheer desperation and said he'd eaten 2 pies, chalking it up to Greasy's amazing cooking skills. That seemed to satisfy his boss. Daring had felt dreadful for the poor colt during the whole episode, but there was no chance she was going to reveal herself now. Daring had heard many a tall tale in seaside cafes of the consequences for stowing away on Captain Pony the Elder's ship, but they were not something she wished to confirm or deny. Although the captain was no pirate, the military stallion had a reputation of treating stowaways worse than Hoofbeard himself. Suddenly the ship lurched. Dirty pots piled on the wash basin clanked against one another, and Greasy Spoon hollered a loud curse. Daring's already weakened body slammed against the splintered wood door, squishing her right wing. She groaned in agony. That wing had never been the same since her nasty crash landing in the jungle near the Yucatan Peninsula. It vexed her more than anything to have an injury. Gah! Daring gritted through her teeth as she inspected the aching appendage. It hurt like mad. Maybe she didn't want to admit it to herself, but Daring Do was becoming very fatigued by her many weeks at sea in search of the crystal sphere of Kahum. Legend said that the magical item could be found in one of the submerged temples of Vehoovious, located 100 fathoms below the surface, held by a statue between 2 golden hooves beneath a shining metal rod. It was believed that the sphere had the power to heal any pony who touched it, no matter the ailment. Too bad the fabled ancient city was even harder to find than the Galloping Host Islands. Like with most treasures, Daring Do felt an intense hunger to find it and make it hers. Or at the very least, stop it from falling into the wrong hooves or claws. Though she'd been unsuccessful in her quest thus far, she wasn't giving up forever. Daring just needed to do more research, delving deeper into the murky mysteries of Vehoovious and Kahum. Then she'd immediately set out on the open seas again, next time with more provisions. Maybe even dried peppered pears, a few apple tarts, and a small pillow. A strong gust of wind blew into the cabin closet where she was crammed. The rickety old mahogany had splintered off in areas, leaving several gaping holes. It was perfect for spying on Captain Pony and a seafaring ruffians, known as the Royal Navy, on board the Blue Peter. Not quite ideal for warmth in the high seas, though. Daring massaged her tender wing. The high winds on board had been rough, too strong for flying. Even so, Daring would never have risked being seen. Not just for a little stretch. She'd surely have been dumped at the nearest port, which was hundreds of miles away from home. By keeping out of sight, Daring had made it all the way to her destination in one piece. She thought of her warm bed back in her little cottage in the woods. Daring racked her brain, but she couldn't remember the last time she'd slept there. Before she had taken off to find the crystal sphere of Kahum, she'd been busy searching for the talisman of Tenochtitlan, and before that, she was waylaid in the jungle with the injured wing, hunting for Aoi Zoto's temple. Things never seemed to slow down for Daring Do, but that was the way she preferred it. As far as she was concerned, an idle life was a boring life. There were always treasures to discover and ponies in distress to rescue. The bosun, a strong yellow stallion known as Steel Anchor, passed by the tiny portal in the door of Daring's hideout. She could tell it was steel by the way his hooves clunked heavily against the ship's wooden deck planks. In fact, Daring could recognize most of the crew now, just from the weeks of eavesdropping and paying close attention to their little quirks. "Hey!" Steel Anchor stopped just outside the closet porthole. "Did you hear about old Mo? He turned." "That so? Darn shame," added Sea Storm, a junior deck cadet. The pony lowered his voice to a murmur. Daring pressed her ear against the glass so she didn't miss a word. She wasn't sure who Mo was and what he had turned to, but the information was precious, no matter what it was. It sounded like the faint glimmer of something intriguing. Sea Storm continued on. "Always had it in him, though. Poor chap. He'd been through a lot with his flank situation and all. Nasty thing. Too bad he couldn't," but the conversation was abruptly halted by the call of a "Land-o!" It was soon followed by another series of shouts from the rest of the crew, bustling around and getting the ship ready to dock. They had finally reached the port. "About time," Daring grumbled to herself. She tossed her map, piece of stale bread, and stolen flagon of cider into her bag and prepared to disembark. If Daring's calculations were correct, the Blue Peter was currently docked at Horseshoe Bay, a sparkling little sapphire inlet on the east coast of the greater Equestria. Once she had successfully escaped the boat, the journey would take about a day to get home, as the Pegasus flies. The thought of stretching her wings made her feathers itch with anticipation. It was always strange to walk on land after so much time at sea, but at least she had other options. It was going to be wonderful to be on solid ground again, even if it meant that every step she took was going to make Daring's hooves feel like lead. "Ouch!" she mouthed silently as she tried in vain to stretch her wings. The massage hadn't really helped. Apparently, even flying was going to be a struggle. "Here goes nothing," she thought, and hoped for the best. She tore out of the galley, leaped off the ship, and flew as fast as she could into the chilly azure sky. All but one of the crew was too busy to notice her. Squaremeal, the cook's scrawny assistant, stood dumbfounded, scratching his mane as the stowaway Pegasus became a tiny speck in the distance. Had he really just seen a gold pony with a gray and black mane fly out of the kitchen closet? Squaremeal then remembered the missing pie and frowned. "Playtime's over, Captain Pony!" Daring laughed as the ship became increasingly tiny beneath her, its little sails rolling up like the whole craft was about to be stashed in a little filly's wooden toy box next to the blocks and dolls. "Thanks for the free ride!" Daring called out with the tip of her pith helmet, though the seafarer didn't hear it. She was already well out of earshot, swooping through gusts and breezes, feeling as free as a dragon during its first migration season. Even though she was starving, exhausted and sore, the golden pony couldn't help but smile as she veered her course homeward. She let the fresh, salty air fill her lungs and thought about what would happen next. Whatever it was, Daring Do couldn't wait to figure it out. There was no time for anything else when adventure was calling your name. Stay tuned next time for Chapter 2, and until then, I'll see you in the next audio read. Stay safe, be good to each other, and as the man Dusty once said, stay brony, my friends.